Now, here's Ed Bernstein.
Hi, welcome to the show. Good afternoon. A little bit later on in this show, we have an author, two authors actually, talking about what happens to you when you have a relationship and you're sent off to war. What is the impact between friends, acquaintances, relationships? What does it really do to your life? The untold story. But right now, talking about mixed martial arts. Now, everybody knows about the UFC. With me is Jeff Meyer, who runs, and this has got to be one of the biggest, best kept secrets in Las Vegas. You have there's a mixed martial arts league, for lack of a better word, my word, called Tuff-n-Uff. And you've been doing this for 20 years, Jeff?
Yeah, believe it or not, it's been about 20 years, Ed.
And what is Tuff-n-Uff?
Tuff-n-Uff is, as you mentioned, amateur fight promotion. We're lucky to be called the biggest amateur fight promotion in the U.S. And I think that's because of the amount of athletes that have gone through our organization and gone on to the professional ranks. So I think that it's safe to say that Tuff-n-Uff is a breeding ground for athletes that want to make it to the next level.
Similar to what the minor league team, like the 51s, would be to a major league team. I mean, this is where, people get trained and you become, as you said, a breeding ground for the UFC. But now, in fighting, I assume that the amateur status is the same as it is in other sports. It means that the fighters are unpaid.
Exactly. They cannot receive any compensation, of course, except for travel. And if the athlete, we oftentimes will allow them to sell tickets, so they're allowed to be remunerated $5 or 20% of the actual ticket price. So the athlete, as you mentioned, in order to maintain his amateur status, cannot be paid except for his travel and perhaps for selling tickets. But in addition, there's a lot of other factors. For example, the rule sets across America are becoming standardized so that it's easier to tell whether an amateur athlete has had, let's call it, semi-pro fight or more of a professional length fight, because our amateurs fight in Nevada for 3-minute rounds, whereas a professional fights for 5 minutes. So oftentimes you might get an athlete that is hailed from even another country or state wanting to fight for Tuff-n-Uff, but the rule sets where they live are different. So we oftentimes have to translate and verify the amateur status, but of course, as you mentioned, just like other sports, the amateurs in mixed martial arts, of course, can't be paid.
And you've been doing this for 20 years, but you've had some really huge events. You recently sold out the Thomas and Maxim, 18,000 plus fans, and you did a great charity event for Three Square.
Yep.
And you do events at the Texas and other venues. Why does somebody become an amateur mixed martial arts fighter? And why not try to go right to the UFC?
Well, that's a great question. And the honest answer is there's no logical jump from just, let's call it, training to going into the UFC. Now, many years ago, when amateur MMA wasn't legal, that was the standard route for an athlete to go, let's say, from maybe collegiate wrestling or a judo background and just jump right into a pro UFC fight. Now, to answer your question more directly, a lot of athletes fight as an amateur in hopes that they'll become a pro someday. But at the same time, we have a lot of athletes that fight for Tuff-n-Uff that, let's call it, maybe want to check off a bucket list item, that maybe were in a local gym here in Las Vegas and trained with a lot of MMA fighters and said, maybe that's something I want to try. I have no aspirations or hopes of being a professional, but it's just something I want to do and see if my body can take it. So there's a full range. I'd like to say that there's the full gamut of kinds of folks that fight for Tuff-n-Uff and fight amateur. But the honest answer is, I'd say a good 80 or 90% are training seriously in hopes of getting to the next level.
Right. Is there an age requirement to be 18 or?
Yes, in Nevada they have to be 18.
Right. And how did you get involved in the mixed martial arts business?
Well, I was a martial artist growing up as a young kid in Chicago, where I grew up. My brother and I were going to karate tournaments every weekend, and my brother's best friend was a junior Olympic judo player and was in Japan actually in the Junior Olympics at a very young age. So he introduced my brother to judo, and then my brother learned jiu-jitsu, and then wrestling in high school. So I was always, let's call it, my brother's punching bag. And so going around to all the tournaments with him and trying to learn from him really developed my passion and interest in the sport. And when my brother and I saw the very first UFC live on pay-per-view, well, it was like a light bulb went off. And my brother always liked to say it was love at first fight. And we knew we had to be involved somehow. We just didn't know how. We were fans for a long time, just going to the very early UFCs. And then in 1994, we promoted our first TuffnUff event in Chicago. It was a kickboxing event because MMA wasn't legal in Chicago back then. But you can trace our name all the way back to 1994 in my high school gym. It was called Adlai E. Stevenson High School outside of Chicago.
I mean, so you have really a similar trajectory as the UFC had. I remember, when the UFC wasn't really, was illegal, I guess is the word, in most states, and then they applied to the Nevada Athletic Commission, got sanctioned here in Nevada, and I can remember the first time Dana White was promoting his first fight here on our show for the UFC, and at the same time you were doing your the TuffnUff thing. Was it for amateurs at that point?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, our very first show was amateur. We were licensed in Nevada very shortly after the UFC obtained license. As you mentioned, I have to give credit where credit's due. They did such a great job in cleaning up and regulating our sport so that it could come out of the dark ages, let's call it, and be legal across the country. So it's, I think, an amazing testament to their hard work that they've been able to get it back on pay-per-view. They're working on legislation across the globe in order to move the sport around the globe. And yes, as they went through a lot of trials and tribulations, TuffnUff, I think by just the sheer nature of being involved in the sport at that time, we also had to go through the dark ages, and luckily enough, we came through it.
Yeah. There was a time, look, I was going to ask you about women, because I remember there was a time I spoke to Dana White about this, and he said, no, it's never going to happen. Well, Dana, you were wrong, and I know you've promoted this and you changed your mind about it, but what is the status, I mean, of women in mixed martial arts, and whether it be TuffnUff or UFC, there seems to be a lot of interest in that.
There is a tremendous amount of interest, and I think that it's great because the females so truly deserve the limelight or the spotlight. Now, I say that because they've had a difficult time finding fights at the UFC, and we have been fortunate enough to have very high-level, talented female athletes, including the current UFC 135-pound champion, Ronda Rousey, who's probably the most famous fighter in the world right now. She fought for TuffnUff as well. So I think that the females are, let's call it possibly the future of the sport. Now, when I say that, I mean at a TuffnUff, oftentimes it's the females that will steal the fight of the night. The crowd just eats it up, and I think it's because maybe they're not used to it or they're not expecting to see it. I oftentimes hear feedback, wow, I didn't know you guys were going to have females, and those girls were really athletic and had a tremendous amount of skill. So oftentimes, as I mentioned, they're the highlight of the show, and I think that there's an upsurgence in talent. There's so many girls across the country now that want to be the next Ronda Rousey. So there's a lot more talent coming through the ranks, and as you mentioned, Dana, of course, had an opinion about females, which at the time was, I respected his decision. There was no talent in the female ranks, so it was difficult to foresee a female athlete in the UFC. But I'm happy to say that they're in the UFC now, and they're probably the most, well, Ronda Rousey is probably one of their most famous athletes. So, everybody's allowed to say things and change their mind down the road.
Oh, yeah, of course. And he did, and to his credit, he's really done a great job of it. Helped along, I think, by Muhammad Ali's daughter in boxing, right?
Yep.
Didn't that open up a lot of doors in this?
Yeah, Laila Ali, she was absolutely opening doors and changing perceptions. People, like, as I mentioned, maybe aren't expecting to see a female fight. The perception for me in the beginning was, well, with an MMA fight, I was thinking, geez, I don't know, do I really want to watch females beating each other up and punching each other in the face?
Well, what is that attraction? Is there kind of a sexist or sexual undertone, or
I
Yeah.
don't think so.
Yeah.
I personally enjoy watching the skill level and the let's call it chess match, which ensues in the cage. They're very high level judo, jiu-jitsu, different martial arts practitioners. So when I watch a fight, I'm watching for really smooth transitions. I'm looking for power punches and things like that. Whereas I think that the majority of our fights, whether it be male or female, have a tremendous amount of skill. So to answer your question, I think the attraction to watching females fighting is, let's face it, it's new. It's not something that most people are used to seeing, and I hope that that will change. And in the future, maybe 5 or 10 years down the road, they should absolutely not have any, let's call it stigma associated with them, and they should be able to compete just in any line of.
And I think this is changing in pop culture. If you look at even movies like Hunger Games and Divergent, it's female, tough fighters, that are becoming the heroines of these shows. If somebody wants to become a mixed martial arts fighter, I mean, there's different paths you could take, I would think. One is, to go and fight amateur, and it's probably the most logical way to do it. In other sports, people are able to go into an Olympic program. That's not yet true for mixed martial arts, but you expect it one day to be an Olympic competition?
I sure do. In fact, we're working very much on helping to make that happen. What I mean by that is this week at the Cox Pavilion, the first ever International Mixed Martial Arts Federation tournament takes place. So there are athletes from all over the world who are competing as amateurs here in Las Vegas, and this group based in Sweden, as I mentioned, the IMMAF, is spearheading taking the amateur program across the globe. And their hope is, of course, to get it into the Olympics. Now, that's been a dream of mine for a long time, and I would love nothing more than to be able to say that TuffnUff had a small part in making that happen, but I would love nothing more than to see our athletes and any mixed martial arts athlete get a chance to compete in the Olympics.
When you talk about the global nature of this, of course, the UFC is now, has its tentacles in basically every country in the world, and just having watched the World Cup games of soccer, you can see that different countries have expertise in different sports. Have you noticed that on mixed martial arts? Are the athletes coming from particular countries?
Yes, well, there are 27 countries represented in this tournament. However, I think it's safe to say that globally, Brazilians,
really,
they train all day.
They've got soccer too. Huh?
They do, yes, and they're very passionate both about, I think, soccer and mixed martial arts. I think that it's safe to say in Brazil, mixed martial arts is like the second biggest sport in the country. And that's because the family that started in the UFC back in the early days, called the Gracie family, is a pioneer of jiu-jitsu. And they're
That
from
was the
Brazil.
Brazilian jiu-jitsu. I mean, that's been around for quite a while, right?
It's been around for quite a while, but the UFC is what helped expose it to the masses and proved that Brazilian jiu-jitsu is the most efficient and effective martial art, whereas any sized person is taught how to defend themselves against any equally or any sized opponent. So you saw in the very early UFCs a gentleman named Royce Gracie, who was most oftentimes the smallest fighter, beating fighters of any weight in the early UFCs. So the Brazilians are, let's just call it, I think, very tough by nature, and they have it in their blood.
And what's your opinion? Given a fight between a pure wrestler and a pure boxer, who wins?
Oh, that's an easy one. The boxer doesn't know how to fight on the ground. Now, a boxer always has a puncher's chance, let's call it, of maybe scoring a clean knockout on the takedown as the wrestler shoots in for the takedown. But I think it's safe to say that once the wrestler grabs hold of the boxer, it's over, because the wrestler will take the boxer down and just start ground and pounding him.
And who, UFC-wise, is the #1 fighter right now that you like?
Well, I think my favorite, as well as many fans' favorites, is Ronda Rousey, the current 135-pound female.
The woman, yeah.
Yeah, and she fought for TuffnUff, and as I mentioned, she's so famous. She's off doing movies with Sylvester Stallone and all these famous actors. I'm so proud of her, and it's so great to see. I'm so happy whenever I see that she's progressing and doing all more awesome stuff.
Mm-hmm. And somebody wants more information about amateur
there is going
fighting,
to be
mixed martial arts
fireworks in
fighting
this
at
fight.
TuffnUff. We have the website. I think we've put it up there a couple times. And so thank you so much, Jeff Meyer. We'll keep our eyes open and keep up the good work. Maybe you'll be having Olympic sports soon.
I sure hope so, and thanks very much for having me today.
You're welcome. We'll be right back with the story of two really good friends, one going off to war and the other not.